The World Cup soccer tournament, sports games are all now going to be additionally protected against drone swarms and the threat. How are you? I'm Chris. This is Warrior. Very glad you're here. We have one of the top experts today, and there's been a lot of discussion about DoD and Department of Homeland Security, Golden Dome, increasing protection of the homeland. We have an expert who is all over that. She's the partner in a law firm, but former acting general counsel of the Department of Homeland Security. Golden Dome, all about Homeland Security, stopping the drone threat, not just military installations, bases, and assets, but major sporting events. That's now been added to the equation. Let's welcome Jennifer Daskal. She is a partner at Venable, a very powerhouse law firm around D.C. She is also a former high-level decision maker at the Department of Homeland Security. Jennifer, thank you so much for taking this time. This is such an important issue.
Thank you. I agree. It's critically important. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I know you can address this. During your tenure, I'm sure there was a lot of discussion of additional threats to the homeland, drone threats to the homeland. What's your response to the FBI opening a new CUAS office in Huntsville?
I mean, there is a huge there's a huge threat vector, and there is a lot more that we need to do as a nation. We need more in authorities, we need more in resources, and we need more in technology as well. And so this is a step forward. It's a very positive step forward that the FBI is doing this.
Excellent. What are some of the kinds of things that they can do? Obviously, they'll coordinate with military, maybe National Guard, perhaps local law enforcement. What are some of the things that can be done to protect stadiums?
Yeah, so my assumption is that they will be using their authority, DOJ. So there's only 4 agencies in the United States that have the authority to do mitigation of drone threats. That's the Department of Justice, including the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense for certain Department of Defense covered assets, and the Department of Energy for certain facilities that hold nuclear materials. And so what the FBI is doing is it is helping to train and to potentially deputize state and local agents and authorities, officials to act on behalf of the department and employing some of the department's authorities in order to put in place expanded protections that are critically needed for really any event in which there's large numbers of people that are gathering in outdoor spaces.
10-4, very well said. I mean, the military is very experienced with forward operating base protection. Obviously, there's discussion about protecting installations, whether there's robotics or sensors on military bases. And of course, there was stepped up security for things like the Super Bowl and other kinds of big events. But this is really a new realm. The drone threat, everyone looks at Ukraine, is a lot more serious. And Homeland Security is front and center in terms of what Golden Dome is seeking to accomplish, what experts like you are spending a lot of time thinking about. So what are some of these steps forward that you think can help further solidify protection?
Just stepping back for a second, I think you're absolutely right. And I think we look at the threat environment in Ukraine and you realize how easy it is to attach a payload to a relatively inexpensive drone. And to date, we have been lucky. We haven't seen anything like that in the homeland, but that is a risk, and it is a huge vulnerability, and it is not costly, and it doesn't take a lot of sophistication to do. And so thinking about counter UAS protections, counter drone protections, and integrating that into all security planning and protocols is absolutely essential across sporting events, entertainment venues, and other places in which there are large gatherings of people. It is way more complicated to do that in a homeland environment than it is to do it in a forward operating base where there's a clear perimeter and it's pretty obvious if something intrudes into that perimeter that is a threat and you can take action against that threat. In an urban environment, in a homeland security environment, it is complicated because you have to think about one, understanding, distinguishing between malicious and non-malicious uses of drones, and then two, thinking carefully about the kinds of mitigation measures if, in fact, there's a determination that there's a potentially malicious or negligent use of drones that poses a threat, but the kind of mitigation measures that you can put in place that avoid other negative consequences like collateral damage to people in the area.
10-4. I'm glad you mentioned that because there's one of the things one of the top experts talk about a lot is this sense of kinetic solutions can be difficult in populated areas. I mean, it's not beyond the realm to think something like a CRAM, a phalanx gun, could be put on a stadium to knock out incoming swarms, or even interceptor missiles. But then there are lots of civilians, right? So, what about high powered microwave or EW, other kinds of innovations that can not only help with radar and sensors distinguish the threat, but then also keep people safer while mitigating it, as you mentioned?
I mean, absolutely. Those kinds of technologies are absolutely the way forward in terms of the homeland security piece of this puzzle. In certain circumstances, kinetic solutions are the right solution, but in a crowded urban environment, they generally are not, and they pose incredible risks. And so there are all kinds of new technologies that are developed, that are being developed, and that need to continue to be supported in order to be able to mitigate the threat at a cost level that is not prohibited for a range of different entities as well.
Well, Roger, that you sound like you're from the Pentagon with talking kinetic effects and interceptors, things like that. But you, as a counsel, as a lawyer responsible for the protocols and the implementations of safety for DHS, that's a massive job. How would you apply that to kind of stadium protection, urban protections, and what are some of the challenges that would involve?
I think, again, going back to where we started, one of the biggest challenges is just the authorities challenge. Right now, there are so few agencies that have the authority to engage in the kinds of advanced detection and mitigation that's needed. And so it's absolutely, in my view, incumbent on Congress, and I know the current administration supports us, to expand those authorities, both for the four federal agencies that currently have that authority, but also to give state and local authorities the opportunities to, with training and with approved technologies, to engage in advanced detection and mitigation. And critical infrastructure owners and operators also, at a minimum, need to have the authority to do the kinds of advanced detection to distinguish between what are legitimate use of drones and illegitimate use of drones. The other thing that we need a much better mapping of our airspace to be able to distinguish what is, ordinarily in the sky and what are the anomalies. And then finally, the other another huge piece of this is getting in place what I know the FAA is currently working on, which is an expansion of a change to the rules by which agencies and entities, by which private entities and others can get temporary flight restrictions put in place. Because again, like in the forward operating base environment, when there's a temporary flight restriction in place, then you know that anything that's crossing into that space is acting illegitimately, and you can take some kind of action against that. But without the temporary flight restriction, it's very hard often to distinguish between hobbyist use of drones, potentially negligent use of drones, and malicious use of drones. And then the final thing I'll say about the technology that's also critically important is a lot of the technology right now is identifying drones that are emitting either a real ID, some sort of signal from the drone, and or operating within certain spectrums that are identified by the current technologies. And in order to really get at the threat, we need technologies that also identify the drones that are not emitting signals and are not operating in the approved kind of spectrum space, because that's where the malicious drones are likely to be operating.
Well, I really like your expertise, and you touched on, you inspired about 50 questions. I want to be sparing with your time, but one of them was the coordination element. That seems so significant when it comes to aligning authorities. I'm familiar with airspace deconfliction, something that the Pentagon does a fair amount of. There's an Army program that does that with drones and sort of military civilian operations, that kind of thing. What are some of your senses about what needs to happen? Because one of the things you mentioned cooperation, one of the things I hear about a lot, I talk to a lot of innovators in the defense world who have technologies, solutions, radars that blanket areas, that do pencil beam kinds of detections, that can perform the analytics to discern a hostile versus an innocent drone of some kind. So there's all kinds of innovations that could apply to the homeland.
Right. Right. So part of it is resourcing. Part of it is giving state and local authorities the money to be able to buy these kinds of technologies. And there is, in fact, a grant program that was announced by FEMA just a couple of weeks ago that was implementing money that was put into the most recent appropriations bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill, in which $500 million is allocated to state and local entities to buy detection and, in certain cases, possibly some mitigation measures. So one is getting the money to the right people to buy the right technology. Two is to matching up the people who are potentially buying it with the right vendors. That's another piece of it. And then the third is matching up the people who have the technology with those who have the authorities to actually employ those technologies as well, and making sure that there is kind of seamless coordination across local, state, and federal authorities, because those authorities will need to work together in the event of an actual threat.
Well, gosh, you seem to have quite a technical expertise. So I want to ask you along those lines a little bit more in terms of the world of AI, because I understand there's RF technologies that can essentially recognize the protocol, the signature of an attacking drone, bounce it off a database, and then make that determination, friendly, foe, in almost a matter of milliseconds. And then in some cases, take over the drone. But then the predicament, right, as we all know with AI, is what happens when there's a drone that's not part of the database? How quickly can those analytics be performed? What happens if there's an unfamiliar threat? Thus, the whole zero trust effort with AI to increase reliability. What are some of your thoughts technically about how that might apply kind of large scale across the US?
I think it's uncharted territory. I think that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in that space. There needs to be work on the standard sides, on the cybersecurity standard side, on the AI standard side as well, and a real, I think, effort to understand and to integrate the technology in an effective way. I think we are beginning to understand how that can work and how that can work effectively in ways that avoid error and avoid missing things that are important as well.
I'm glad you mentioned the question about not emitting a signal, because one of the things I understand is that in places like Ukraine, in order to not reveal location or give away emitting a signature, drones are attached to things like fiber optic cable. And there are different ways of enabling drones to operate in a GPS denied environment. How do you defend against or even track something like that?
I think it's challenging. Again, I think this is an area where there needs to be continued innovation and research and development, and doing it at scale and at the speed that's necessary to detect a threat and be able to respond to it. It poses challenges as well. It's again why I go back to the importance of having the right detection systems in our airspace so we can map what's there and identify anomalies with enough time to take action to respond to the threat.
Last question. I'm glad you mentioned that about mapping the airspace. That seems so critical. How easy do you think it will be for federal, local law enforcement to integrate with military grade counter drone technologies? As a DHS senior leader, how can they better interoperate with DoD? That's already happening in a massive way with the FBI, DoD, DHS. What are some of the challenges and what needs to happen to kind of streamline that?
I think that some of the initiatives that are underway right now in terms of getting grant money out to state and locals is very helpful. I think there needs to just be ongoing communication and conversations across the agencies with respected vendors and training and demo opportunities. I think there needs to be increased opportunities for companies to do the kinds of testing and training and demos that are very important, and that requires some nimbleness on the part of the FAA as well to grant the waivers that allow for that kind of testing and training and demos. So all of that is part of the solution. And there needs to be an agency that's kind of responsible for mapping the airspace in this way, which we don't currently have.
Wow. Interesting. Okay. Jennifer Daskal, former general counsel for the Department of Homeland Security, a powerhouse expert clearly with the technology and the legalities, logistics, challenges of protecting the homeland. I want to thank you for your time and expertise today. And gosh, let's hope that with the FBI's new office in DoD, that there's increased cooperation, collaboration, and that the protections are ubiquitous as quickly as possible, right?
Let's hope so.